So good morning everyone and welcome to the Surgical Grand Round. As I said last week, we're very privileged today to have a non-surgeon giving us a talk. Hamish is a senior management consultant. He really has dedicated his time in delivering better service outcomes and cost reductions across NHS and adult social care. So music to the ear of management who as you see, are abundant in the audience this morning. Hamish has pioneered a new way to better understand and improve services and systems, but from the perspective of the patient, which is really very novel and interesting. So he fuses operational research, operational improvement to achieve better healthcare in a nutshell, and really looking forward to you telling us about it, Hamish, and thank you for coming all the way.
Morning all, thank you Freddie. As Freddie outlined, I'm not a clinician. Can you hear me? My background is management consulting. Sorry, get that right. But it's okay because I mean you no harm. Because I know you guys have had quite a few experiences with a variety of management consultants, past, present, and no doubt future. I have actually worked in the NHS in a management capacity and in public services. And before that, I spent slightly longer at university because I wanted to be an academic. And hopefully you'll see this through this work. It was a few years ago, through a combination of personal experience. My father died of vascular dementia and professional experience. I saw the dysfunctionalisation of what we've done in healthcare. And it's no clinician's fault. It's just the way we have badly designed, managed, and thought about how we try to improve healthcare. And I passionately believe in the last 40 years, we've done a number of things very badly. We've tried to commercialise healthcare. We've tried to over-medicalise, over-specialise, and then we've fragmentalised, if that's even a word, healthcare, when actually I think what we need to do is rehumanise it, bring it back to the reason why we have health care, and I mean healthcare in the generalist sense. I, for one, for example, don't see these arbitrary distinctions between adult social care and community services. I've never met anyone who can tell me the difference between the two, and I've worked in both, and primary care too. I'm a firm believer in designing services against patient demand, of which you're about to hear a lot of. There's a lot of slides, so bear with me. Hopefully they're all value-adding, but in an hour or so you can tell me whether that's true or not. I'm going to give you two quotes, one to start with and one to finish with. The first one is a management guru who I have a lot of time for and a lot of respect for. It's a short, pithy quote, but I just want you to capture that and remember this as we talk. And then the quote at the end will be a medical quote. We'll do three things. I'm going to introduce what I call humanising healthcare, what it is, contrast it with current conventional approaches, and then outline what it isn't. I'm going to give you a real example of a large district general hospital, and I've covered teaching hospitals such as this one. I've covered specialist hospitals such as Moorfields, and I've covered district generals, I've covered community mental health, I've covered primary care, I've even done this in adult social care and children's services. And the amazing thing is, the pattern is the same everywhere, but it will challenge convention. And equally, how we go about driving and delivering improvement in service organisations, and healthcare is a complex service organisation, has to change too. I'm going to start with the red herrings, as I call them, what are commonly held healthcare beliefs. I don't think anyone would disagree. Well, I'm going to ask, does anyone disagree with those three beliefs? Because we hear about these all the time. One is that we've got an ageing, growing elderly population. Statistically and numerically, that is true. People are getting older. Second, that people want more and more. You and I demand more and more of our expectations on healthcare services. And the third one is, because of the first two, there's more demand on the system. Well, I'm going to challenge that third one, because empirically that's not true. Okay? I will challenge the second one, because we don't collect the data in any such sophisticated, intelligent way to be able to tell us actually whether that's empirically true. That's an anecdote. I have experience of, I believe, therefore, you're demanding something I can't give you. That's not the same thing. By the way, the friends and family test is not an intelligent gauge of expectation. Net promoter scores and all of that good stuff doesn't work. And it is possible that you can get old and die gracefully, maybe with 1, 2, 3, 4 comorbidities or complex conditions, and not cause much problem to the healthcare system, okay? It's equally apparent, and you're going to see an actual case of this, that you can be in your teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and your life be off the rails and cause an awful lot of demand on healthcare services. I think this is a universal truism. I think it applies to all healthcare systems. I've given talks in a number of other countries, and because they see the UK and the NHS as world leaders, they tend to copy. But they tend to copy our bad ideas and our bad concepts as well. Conventional analysis on the left-hand side is what I refer to, and I mentioned it to Tim just a few moments ago, as activity obsession disorder. It's a belief that you can design, manage and improve complex service systems such as healthcare on an understanding only of activity, work activity. And off the back of that, you can drive down costs, and that will improve services. We do this year in, year out, in cost improvement schemes, in patient flow programs, and in commissioning world, they spend an awful lot of time doing exactly the same in their QIP program, in QIP schemes. And then we think we then have to drive things harder, and we make more assumptions. I think this is fundamentally the wrong thing to do. I call this back to front thinking, or it's like trying to drive your motor vehicle via the rear view mirror. There's two guaranteed outcomes of this, and this is convention how we do it. You're going to go really, really slowly, and at some point in time you're going to crash, and it's going to be expensive. I think the outcomes are that we sub-optimize services, dreadful phrase. We give poor patient experience, it results in higher costs, and it reduces staff morale. It demoralises people. Humanising healthcare, on the other hand, is actually, why don't we just stop and ask, who are the people we're doing work activity to, and how much is that costing, and ask these questions around why. I think it's elegant, it's simple, it gets to the nub of the problem. And then improvement is not about spending an eternity in management meetings, devising yet more paperwork, and then trying to project manage that paperwork and never seeing anything happen in the real world. It's about management people working with clinicians, medical staff and frontline, redesigning services around cohorts of patients, not making big assumptions around arbitrary pathways, okay, such as the world's greatest diabetes pathway. And I ask a simple question, how many linear diabetes patients do you ever see in a year? And the answer is none. Okay, because everyone that has diabetes will have 2, 3, 4, 5 other conditions as well. And so even if you have a world-class diabetes service, if everything else doesn't work, they will still fall through the gaps, and that's what you see. Points of principle, I'm not going to go through each of these, but effectively this work is about understanding patient demand as the first point. How many people cause us to do how much work activity leads to how much costs. Humanising the analysis is important. As a consequence of that, I use a really simple framework, which is what I call PAC. People, activity, costs. Okay? Understand the former to understand the latter. And you do exactly the same in improvement. Okay? And the last one I think is really important, that systems inform patient behaviour. I think it is the case that for the majority of people, the way they behave, whether they be professionals or patients, is a consequence of how they're treated. But others may disagree. But I think I'll be able to show that empirically, I hope. This work relies on the Pareto principle, of which I'm sure you're all very well aware of. It's funny that we don't use it, though, in systems, in understanding and designing them, because it's a natural law. Not my phrase, but Joseph Juran, who was now departed American management guru. Bear in mind that phrase, the vital few and the useful many, because I will use that quite a bit in what you're about to hear. It is the case that patient demand is uneven. Small numbers drive all the activity and all the costs. But yet we don't design and manage and improve our healthcare systems based on that knowledge in any sensible, systematic way. How humanising healthcare works, and I hope you liked the dumbbell diagram, is a heavy focus on research. And that research is not about crunching numbers, so you'll see a lot of numbers in a few moments, but it's about combining quantitative analysis with qualitative analysis, understanding the what and why things work the way they do. Once you do that and fuse what I call operational research techniques, it actually gives you everything you need to know in order to improve your service. The second stage is iteratively redesigning systems and services around cohorts of patients, not pathways, to improve outcomes, reduce costs, and create greater sustainability. And then the third phase is effectively sustaining and scaling that. So can we increase the volumes of the cohorts of the patients and take it into areas where we hitherto haven't done so far? That is distinct from how we conventionally do analysis and do improvement. Another way of describing it is, if you understand the what and the why, that'll inform you as to how and where you do improvement. And I will come back to technology at the end of this presentation, but for me, technology is the last thing you think about, not the first thing, okay? Technology works on simple, routine processes and procedures. Often, what we do is we make the mistake of taking a complex process and thinking we can digitalize it with disastrous consequences. I'll come back to that later. So far, so good. That's the theory and the approach out the way. Now I'm going to talk about how you analyse healthcare, and when you analyse healthcare from this viewpoint, what you find. As I said, I'm going to use a real-life example. This is a large district general in the south of England, but I'll let you into a little secret. I have done this work in Oxford in not too distant past, and the patterns are exactly the same, whether they're a teaching hospital or a district hospital. What do I mean by demand? Demand for me is person-shaped. It's how many interactions a human being has with a service in any minute, hour, week, month, year, and here's the trick, multiple years. So this work looks at time series data, something I find that in management at least we never do. We try and benchmark performance over the last financial quarter or last year's quarter, and then we make assumptions. It also turns on its head the idea of population health management. What do I mean by that? Well, in this constituency, this hospital thought it catered for 500,000. Now, where it got that figure from was the CCG combined populations of 500,000 people. But it didn't actually see anything like 500,000 people coming through its doors every year. It saw less than 163,000. I've got 5 years' worth of time series data, and that's my rule of thumb, to go back 5 years. On the top, the absolute demand is absolute human beings who enter this hospital in any shape or form. And that might be for several outpatient appointments or one A&E visit in any 1 year. You'll see that the myth that we've got rising demand is not true, because that population growth is actually less than the locality population growth that the hospital served. And this is a truism that I found in urban areas or rural areas, whether it's small district hospitals or whether it's large teaching hospitals. That will give some people cognitive dissonance for sure, because the media beliefs are, and what we're told all the time, is that demand is rising. Well, we capture demand incorrectly. It's activity that we record, monitor, and measure. Why? Because our healthcare system, certainly in England, is based on tariffs, work activity, meaning more activity, more money. That's not true either. Expressed in percentage terms, it's a steady state. In every healthcare economy, including this one, about a third of the population will use the acute in any shape or form. 2/3 won't. In primary care, the balance is different, and if you're interested in that, I'd encourage you to watch my TEDx that I did a couple of years ago where I talk about primary care, and that was here. Thoughts on that before I move on? Because that does challenge convention. You can't improve healthcare services looking at activity and cost. They are lagging indicators of what you've done. You need to look at a leading indicator. And the best leading indicator is the people aspect, because that will determine what the activity needs to be. This is the same hospital. This is a decomposition chart for 1 year using my PAC framework. So that is showing you everybody that came in a financial period, 12 months, into this hospital and how they filtered through. We do not do this in healthcare analysis, and I think we need to. That's the PAC framework explained. That's how the 163,000 get filtered down. If I just, for this moment in time, focus on A&E, or what we now refer to as ED, you'll see that actually this hospital doesn't cater for 500,000. In urgent and emergency care, it doesn't even cater for 163,000. Predictably, it will see 63,000 people in any shape or form every year. That's about 13%. And the rule of thumb I found doing this in 8 or 9 areas now is that that A&E percentage varies between 12 to about 14% everywhere. And then when it comes to how many do we admit, the challenge isn't even 60-odd thousand people. It gets lower to 20,000 people, which equates to about 4%. Okay? Because you can't actually improve healthcare systems on 163,000 people. But that's fine, because you don't have to in urgent and emergency care. The other interesting thing in healthcare is that it is complex. It is more complicated than, say, retail, because you're dealing with different customer bases. In elective plan care, by and large, you're dealing with different people. They are not the same as those that you will see in urgent and emergency care. When you see both of them appearing in the system, that's actually telling you something. That phenomena I'm going to talk about later in this presentation. It's called plan care tipping. It's when you see loads of elective care patients who have tipped from plan care into emergency care. That's a signal that the design of the elective services isn't working for a number of those patients. However, when you fuse the data together, and what do I mean by that? Well, in the acute world, it's how many times do we see you in the urgent care system versus the plan care system. You come at the pyramid of consumption, which is what I call the vital few. It's the same here as well. This hospital actually rested on 8,500 unique human beings. They were behind a third of all the work that was done, year in, year out. At the top of that tree, there was less than 1,400 people. And you're going to see an example of what we did with just one of them in the top 1%. This work actually challenges the Kaiser Permanente logic as well. Kaiser Permanente now is about 30, 40 years old, the thinking that at the top of the apex of hospitals and healthcare systems are increasingly frail elderly people whose job is you've got to case manage them around their complex comorbidities. In other words, they're old, they've got loads of things going wrong with them, and therefore you have to case manage them. That's statistically and empirically not true. of which I will explain in a few moments' time. What you're seeing here are two Pareto charts applied using the PAC framework over 12 months, looking at A&E, attendances and admissions. On the left-hand side is attendances. You'll see that figure of 60,000 people at the bottom row. And admissions on the right-hand side looking at 20,000. Now, if we're wanting to do something to improve our performance on the 4-hour target, for example, and achieve perhaps the triple aim of the NHS, we don't even have to think about it as a 60,000 people challenge or a 20,000 people challenge, because as you'll see, in attendances, and it will be the same here as well, every year 5% of the work is actually just over 3,000 people. Sorry, I'll correct myself. 5% of people, 3,000, are behind nearly 20% of all the activity in the work, in attendances. Okay? So if we want to do something sensibly in a SIP or a Quick World or a Vanguard world or a care integration world, let's go find out about these 3,000 people. What's happening in their world? And how do we need to redesign that? Flipped over to admissions, you see the numbers get even smaller. Keep your mind's eye on the 1%, the 3%, the 5%. Again, even when it comes to admissions activity in emergency care, we're dealing with just over 1,000 people, nearly behind 20% of everything we do. Why are those numbers, 218, 652 and 1,084, important? Because that's the bed problem. This is emergency bed capacity in this hospital. Now, I will challenge it, because this is also a truism I found in every hospital again, that we don't have a bed capacity problem as much as we've got a service capability problem. We never ask the question, how many of the same people are in our beds year in, year out? What I found is, when you get to the 5% figure, they're typically behind 40% of all the bed capacity. Now, I can be candid. When I showed this to the chief operating officer at this hospital, I got a reaction. And that reaction was that she left the room for 5 minutes. I thought that was a good sign. I thought she'd come back and say, Hamish, clear your desk. On Monday morning, we need to find out everything we need to know about 218 people, because this is going to solve my winter bed pressure problem. She came back, I finished the talk, and the only comment she made was that she criticised a typo in my concluding slide, which says something. 218 people behind 15%. Now, how conventionally, including in this hospital, we will look at bed capacity is we won't look at numbers of patients, we won't look at the percentage bed days breakdown of those human beings, we'll just focus on activity numbers. And those activity numbers go up and up and up. And then we'll sit in meetings and we'll have some guesstimates and ideas and brainstorming, or brain showering, or brain thoughts about what we can do. When actually, we don't need to do any of that. Just go find out how we need to redesign services that are going to improve human beings' lives. The case I'm going to show you in a minute was one of these 218. That reference cost at the bottom is what's called SUS reference costs. It grossly underestimates the true cost of providing a service. So as clinicians have told me, including here, you can multiply that 3, 4, 5 times to get the real cost. That's the other problem in healthcare. We need to work out true system costs, not use guesstimated reference costs. We can do that, but it requires some effort. I said this work challenges Kaiser Permanente, and it does. Because empirically, when you ask, okay, who are these vital few? How old are they? You find that 2/3 of them typically are under 65, 70 years of age. The third of them that are over are the frail elderly cohort, and they'll be the ones that are causing the problems with delayed transfers of care. I did some work in Oxford some years ago on delayed transfers of care, and it was a problem of 1,900 people. And this hospital sees nearly 230,000 people in any one year. Okay. On the other side, the other thinking is all these people have got common chronic conditions and that's why they're coming in a lot. Well, ACS stands for ambulatory care conditions. They're the common chronic things, the 18 or 19 conditions that we know people have a lot: angina, diabetes, dementia. What's interesting is when these people come in and get admitted, it's not for common chronic conditions. I'll explain what it is for in a moment. Patient flow. Are we all familiar with the term, we need to improve patient flow? Every hospital has a patient flow program. The big problem is because we think that more activity means more money, therefore we just need to flow more patients more quickly, we never take the time to work out, are we making a profit or a loss on every single human being that comes through? And the nifty trick here is when you link financial data via activity data sets, it's all there, we just don't do it, via NHS number or unique identifier, you begin to find out the real cost and whether we're making a profit or a loss on you. And the real staggering feature, and these are those cohorts in all their glory, depending on whether they've used a lot of urgent or a lot of planned care, is actually the one I've ringed in red are the vital few cohort groups, the 8,500 in this case. They're the ones behind the operating deficits in every single hospital. And the range is particularly significant. The top 5 vital few will always be behind between 70 to 100% of the net operating deficit of the hospital. And by definition, of the healthcare economy as well, when you follow these people out into primary and community mental health. The read over in community mental health is 75 to 85%. In other words, they are the same people, and they're the same people in primary care as well. As I say, if you want to know more about primary care, have a chat with me or watch my TEDx, where I talk about that in a little bit more detail. I'm going to be quiet for 30 seconds. This is a real-life example, Miss Vulnerable, of what I call a pinball patient who you see a lot of in urgent and emergency care. For sure they have medical problems, but we need to deal with them holistically and not in a very siloed fashion. The only thing I'll say, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, that was the true system cost for one of those top 1% for 1 year. What do I mean by activity obsession disorder and where the system creates its own wasteful work? Well, take the example in her case, as you read through. She did have chronic conditions. You'll note she was a large lady, so she did have diabetes. But when she needed to have her repeat medications given, it simply wasn't a case of her going to her local GP because, I'm not being flippant, but she couldn't get to her local GP. She equally couldn't phone her local pharmacy, so what the protocol was that she would phone 999. This is no lie, this is genuine, this is what happens, because we just don't think. She did phone 999. Ambulance would come out. You see this in the case notes. So this work is qualitative and quantitative. You have to go through case notes. And I've spent many hours in basements going through this, because it's a fantastic mine full of data and resource. It tells you everything, but we never use it. The ambulance would come out. It would quickly discover it wasn't fit for purpose, so a bariatric ambulance would then be called. The bariatric ambulance could actually take this woman back to the hospital, but it couldn't physically get her out of her downstairs social housing flat. So then the fire brigade would be called. You laugh, and it is comical, but this happened really, really often. And then you began to realise that's why the downstairs kitchen window is boarded up, because that's how they got her out. And the council never bothered to repair it because, hey, what's the point? Then the fire brigade would get her out, she'd be put on the bariatric ambulance, she'd be taken into A&E, she'd be met by a junior consultant who may not have known her or her case history. And what do you think then happened? Remember, she only went in to get repeat medications. She was disproportionately admitted. And when she got admitted, she wasn't taking up one bed, she was taking up 2. She was given to us because both the hospital and the CCG had effectively given up. They didn't know what to do. That last point about not meeting eligibility criteria is around continuing healthcare funding. She was assessed as not being suitable for this on 7 separate occasions. I'll come back to that later. Improvement. Convention is analyse activity obsession disorder. And then off the back of that, we do a lot of conventional project management. Are people familiar with the term PMO, Project Management Office? It's what I call reporting to talk and talking to report, often in board level meetings, but results in no change in the real world, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then off the back of that, we say, well, what do? Well, we'll standardise everything within an inch of our life. Standardisation is fine when the problem to solve is that you've got loads of standard patients. But if you haven't got standard patients, a standard pathway is going to create a mismatch in both activity and costs. There was a great cybernetics genius, H.E. Ashby, in Oxford in the 1930s, that devised the law of requisite variety. And I think we should heed his advice today. In other words, what he was saying is where you've got variety of need, demand as I call it, the best way to meet that variety of demand and need is by variety of response. And if the variety of need is predictable, and this is predictable, demand in healthcare is really predictable, then the responses can be equally as predictable. Okay? But trying to fit the non-standard patient into a standard pathway never works. So what I think we need to do is understand patient demand, then understand the nature of the activity, what it is we're doing that works or doesn't work, and then get to work on fixing that and designing it for those predictable cohorts. That's the prototyping. Less talk, more action. Less boundaries between management and clinicians. We work together. You have skills that I do not have, and I may have some skills that you may not have. And then the name of the game, starting with the vital few, is to customise their care. In other words, give them what they need to solve or manage their problems better. For some, we'll be able to solve them completely. Okay? For others, it's about managing them in a more intelligent way. Improvement, therefore, looks like this. Ask the question for every single human being, what matters? Because we did this with Miss Vulnerable. It was the first time she'd ever been asked the question. What does good look like for you? What do you need from us? How do we help you, as opposed to telling you we can't help you and pushing you away? And that's why they pinball. Performance metrics. We use a lot of averages in the NHS, like average length of stay. But an average of an average, when you're dealing with these numbers of people, is a very, very dodgy number. So we need to complement those average metrics with more intelligent means. How often do we get it right first time, or second time, or third time, or fourth time? Not that we're going to name and shame and blame the person trying to do better work, but it's going to help us learn how to do more intelligent work. Representing demand. What do I mean by that? Well, what's the probability that if we've seen you in any one year, you're coming back the next for reasons that we don't know about? Well, in this area, it's 60%. And in the other hospital, in this place, it was 55%. That's extortionately high numbers, given that healthcare demand is predictable. And then pack profiling. Don't benchmark with someone 200 miles away whose demand profile will be different, but use the data and materials you've got in your own system. And this is what we did with Miss Vulnerable and others like her. How much are we doing, and how much are we doing better than what we did last year? And are we seeing a tangible difference on the bottom line? Think about costs as the last thing, not the first thing. Paper prototyping and work prototyping is actually, what you find is all these people are clustered in geographical entities. They're not spread over localities. They won't be in Oxfordshire either. In fact, I know they're not. Okay? In this hospital, 20% of the ambulance demand was coming from 1,500 people. These top 5 lived within a 6 or 7 mile radius of the hospital. We know where they are. that should then tell us about how we design our services to respond more intelligently, where we put our staff. I think we could still use, the likes of the Professor Robert Sheldon's in the post-war period. He who devised something quite magical, which would still be revolutionary today for his patients in Wolverhampton. He would conduct outpatient surgeries in marketplaces. He would come to them because he knew it made more sense. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute we have to do that for every single human being that needs an outpatient appointment, but if we know that disproportionate amounts of demand are created in certain localities, and that's a nice way of explaining what I'm trying to get at, then we need to be alert to how we need to design our workforces to meet that demand straight away. And then the working prototype, start small, because you only have to have an impact on relatively small numbers of people to see big system changes, both in terms of performance improvement, cost reduction, and improvements in their lives and the lives of the people trying to help them. Because what I've also experienced doing this work is the sheer frustration of people at the front line, including the very junior doctor who invited me here today, because he's been attuned to this work and he sees these pinball patients coming in a lot, and he can tell that they're coming in, he can predict when they're coming in, because this work is really predictable. It does involve changing the process. This is a typical A&E process or ED process. The whole system and systems in healthcare are designed to make you wait. 2 routes in, patients receive at least 2 types of process. And if we think about it, triage came about from the battlefield, where it was chaotic. So it made sense to marshal resources in an intelligent, managed way. But if we also think about it, that healthcare demand in human being terms is really predictable, there's no value to triage. And what we should have learned, and we have really learnt it, but we haven't then acted upon it, is a couple of years ago, when we had the junior doctor strike, the mother of necessity meant that we had to do away with triage. We put the expert at the front. I'm a big believer in the apprenticeship model of working. How I learnt this was learning this through my mentor. I didn't wake up one morning and think, I'm going to develop something called Humanising Healthcare. I learnt it through trial and error, working with people that were more knowledgeable than me. And I think perhaps we need to think about, as opposed to getting juniors firefighting and ordering up barrages of tests and procedures to be safe, then a senior may have a look and say, no, I want that done again, or you haven't done this, and then that's rework. Then perhaps the senior works with cohorts of juniors, and the junior will work and learn quicker. Just some thoughts. Because if you think about it like that, the process will change as well. And bear in mind what I mentioned earlier that you saw on the slide. In terms of breaches of targets, these vital few are typically behind 30 to 50% of all the A&E breaches. They're also behind a similar number of those that get admitted into observation and assessment units behind A&E. The best observation or assessment unit is really no observation and assessment unit, if everything is predictable. Don't treat the 4-hour target as what you drive by. Treat it as a constraint and understand who you need to work on in order to better meet that target. What I've done in the past is use an observation unit and put it to the front, so that when we know these people are coming in, as long as they haven't got a genuine medical emergency, and typically in any A&E unit in any 1 year, only 7 to 13% of people that actually need, have a genuine emergency will need that, then you don't put them through a triage process in A&E. And in any case, as we know, when your life is really at stake, heart attack, stroke, you don't go through that process because we don't have the time. You'd be dead. Back to Miss Vulnerable. I'm not going to say anything here. I'll just let you read this. True story. what you can do when the focus is on human beings, not activity. She recognised that things went wrong in her world when her principal carer, her mother, passed away, and then everything just fell apart. No one was helping. And we just asked humane questions and then got to work on the back of that. What do you need? We did not lecture her. It happened on one occasion when she was admitted or attended A&E. And of course, if you didn't know the background to this lady, you'd see a grossly obese individual with needs. And so that response was to tell her that she needed to lose weight. But she had mental health problems and learning disability. So trying to rationalise that with that person is designed to fail. And then we had to do some rework to encourage her, to persuade her that she wasn't about to die within the next year to 2 years. But that's great learning. That's great system learning for everybody. And the focus was not on the obesity. The focus was on how can we help you manage better. And she recognised and she told us that she couldn't live on her own. So that's fine, you won't. And the pot of money we used for her was the very pot of money she was refused eligibility criteria for on 7 separate occasions. And this is what we do a lot in community mental health and adult social care. The best service is often no when we put the referral in. Why don't we just say yes and see if we can actually save money by giving some service and help? And again, it's nobody's fault. This is the way this system is currently designed. I talked about planned care tipping. Another example. I got a little bit of profile a couple of years ago for the BBC because Adam Brimelow, who was at the time working for the BBC, got interested in this story. If you're interested, there's still a news article up there called "Is the NHS Stuck with Soaring Demand?" Have a read of it. The answer is no. And you will, off the back of that, learn and read about Mr. Mars Bar Man. I'll explain why Mars Bar Man, because he came into this very healthcare economy. Planned care tipping is when we start to see you in elective care and your elective care starts to increase and then disproportionate numbers of people then tip into urgent and emergency care. When I was doing this work in Oxford, 75% of your top 5 were planned care tippers. And when you get into the detail, you find that actually the reasons behind much of this are actually in inefficient processes, whether they be in bookings, referrals, outpatient clinics. In the case of this man, he had 3 problems wrong with him. He needed a triple heart bypass, but he had prostate cancer that was being treated by another hospital. Before he had the heart operation, we needed to make a quick assessment as to whether we took out his compacted wisdom tooth or not, because that posed an infection control problem. And that's where things went wrong. 2 referrals from a dentist into the hospital got lost. What should have happened in a matter of weeks took 7.5 months. Ambulance gets called on a wet Monday evening because he had a suspected heart attack. He tips. He breached A&E. He spent 2 weeks in a cardio unit. He got transferred to another hospital, spent another week. At the very time that the consultant that was due to operate on him went on leave. He then got booked for day 2 of the junior doctor strike for his procedure. That got cancelled, obviously. He managed to get his heart sorted out, but can you see the wasteful work, activity and costs that the system creates because of the inefficiency? Why he was called Mr. Mars Bar Man is because the 4th ENT consultant that saw him in his initial first 2 weeks tried to explain to him that because he had 3 problems, not 1, he was, quote, like a wonky Mars bar on a production line. He had to be taken off and put to the back. Now, he didn't have problems such as Miss Vulnerable. He didn't have emotional, psychological, social issues. but he was touched at the end of this process. Now, I've had this validated and verified by numerous clinicians, not least David Cameron's brother-in-law, Dr. Andrew Bishop of Hampshire Hospital, who, when I talked him through this, because he's a cardiologist, he just burst out and laughed. And he said, I see these people all the time in my clinics because we pick them up. So that's a real signal that we can do something about this, because this problem is self-generating. It's caused through acute hospitals and CCGs, quotes, turning the taps down or turning the taps off, making people wait longer in the belief that we can save a few bob. It was official guidance at the beginning of this year to deal with the winter pressure problem. But hopefully you'll be aware now that these are different patients to the other people, the pinball patients. So don't treat them the same. To conclude, a little bit about technology. Technology needs to be the last thing you focus on, not the first. We need to improve processes and make processes effective before we think about digitalising anything, okay? If you digitalise an inefficient, ineffective process, you're just going to create a double negative, which is going to be more inefficiency and more costs, okay? Think of how easy it is to procure equipment and supplies in hospitals. It's the same principle if you combine technology with a process flow, which means we put the wrong person at the front, and then you deal with a person who's not an expert telling you no and why you can't have a piece of kit. And then we do that several times. It's exactly the same as with pinball patients. The activity and the costs get worse. So, to conclude, patient demand is stable in healthcare systems, but it's uneven. Small numbers drive all the mayhem and are behind all the performance issues, all the morale-sapping work, and all the costs. We need to focus improvement on initially those small numbers of patients to see big impacts and big benefits. Studying patient demand is the first thing we should do. And then intelligent service redesign needs to be around cohorts of patients, and we can do this because they are geographically clustered and they are predictable, not arbitrary pathways. And if we do that, I think we can begin to then understand how we think about care integration, because this is my last point, which I'll finish on. Integration of care is seen as the panacea for everything we have to now do. And it has been the case for decades. But if we're being honest, no one really has got a clue how to do it. Well, most people, and I include myself here, don't need integrated care. I just need, when I need health care services, an effective transactional response. But these top 5% need something different. They're the ones that are behind the activity and the costs. They're the ones that need integrated care services to work when they need it to work. And last point on digital, it needs to be not by default, not to replace human beings, but to complement them. And so by design, it needs to make people's lives easier as opposed to harder. I said I'd finish with a quote, and I will. I think what he said then was right, and I still think it's the case today. If you don't believe me, you can read some of these quotes. On the left-hand side is the senior nurse that worked with me and her team on Miss Vulnerable, and the Miss Vulnerables and Mr. Vulnerables. And on the right-hand side is a quote from an associate director when I did some patient cohort streaming of A&E. So, a more effective process around these vital few means that you actually achieve the target by not driving performance by the target. You can have these slides, by the way, see. That's not a problem. Thank you for your time this morning. I finished just on time. Happy to take any questions you might have.